I know you're wanting to listen to this episode of the Comics Alternative, but before we get started, let me just remind you guys that it's the gift-giving season. Now, that may be obvious, but one of the things that's not so obvious is that you can get all of your stuff and help out the podcast by going to comicsalternative.com/Amazon. Click through on our Amazon banner that you find on that page, and whatever you get during that visit to Amazon, the Comics Alternative will get a few cents kickback. So, whether it be Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, or Festivus, get your gifts through our Amazon Associate link. It's a smart way to get your books, and you'll be helping out the podcast. And isn't that what the holiday season is all about? Helping our podcast. This is the Comics Alternative, episode 166, reviews of Killing and Dying, Taddle Creek number 36, Barrier number 1, and the unabridged graphic adaptation of iTunes Terms and Conditions. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Gene, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And on this review show, we're going to be talking about several relatively new titles. We're going to begin with the latest book from Adrian Tomine, Killing and Dying. After that, we're going to look at issue number 36 of Taddle Creek. And then from there, we're going to look at a new digital comic from the team of Brian K. Vaughan and Marcos Martin, Barrier. And then after that, we're going to look at a curious couple of comics from R. Sikoryak, the unabridged graphic adaptation, iTunes Terms and Conditions, Part A and B, and Parts C and D. But before we get into those titles, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some wonderful, incredible specials just in time for the holiday season. Now, sometimes those specials are at 45% off the cover price. Sometimes they're 50% off the cover price. But often, the discounts are much more impressive than that.
Yeah, and this month we've got a DC Neil Adams variant bundle, because Neil Adams is doing homages to Neil Adams covers for for DC Comics.
And why not?
Yeah, 45% off on that bundle. There's a DC Kids bundle and a Marvel Kids bundle, both at 50% off. Marvel relaunch bundle at 50% off. I'm guessing you can have a Marvel relaunch bundle every single month, because that seems to be what Marvel does, is relaunch their books. There's a DC new miniseries bundle, a Vertigo new series bundle. These are all 50% off. And even a Valiant bundle at 50% off as well.
That's right. There are a lot of different bundles you can get, and always at great discounts, and not just for the holiday season, because you'll find these specials not only December, but we guarantee you into 2016 as well. So go to the website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to get in touch with them, send them an email, and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Indeed.
How have things been going with you, Gene?
Super busy, just gearing up for the end of the year. My online comic is nearly done. I have to figure out what I'm going to do next. I have a lot of things I want to do next, but I won't have to do a comic every single day in 2016.
Are you going to fit? I was going to ask, are you going to feel a sense of relief or emptiness?
A little bit of both, but not as much emptiness, because I'm going to keep drawing and doing other stuff and doing some stuff with the things I've already drawn. But it would be nice, like, like last week, Thursday I went out to a movie, Friday went out to a band show. So that meant Wednesday night I had to draw 3 comics to make sure that I could actually do something Thursday night and Friday night. It'd be nice to just be able to, like, maybe take a night off to just take a night off and not have to, like, plan 3 days before it to figure out how I'm going to get the next comic up.
Yeah. And just to remind our listeners, they can go to your Tumblr website to see the latest illustrations, right?
That's right. That's comicsmachine.tumblr.com. And we'll be coming back to Tumblr later on in the show as well.
Yeah, cool. So we've got a lot to talk about. You want to go ahead and jump into the titles?
Yeah, we're going to start off with Killing and Dying, the new collection from Adrian Tomine. That's a drawn and quarterly book, and it's it's an anthology of basically 6 short stories.
That's right. And in fact, this is what Tomine has been doing for the past several books of his. Actually, I guess almost from the very beginning for the most part, when he came out with Optic Nerve, which began back in the 90s as a mini-comic that he would actually self-publish in the true mini-comic sense. And he would publish several of those and then collect them. Now, with those earlier mini-comics, those were ultimately collected in book form in 32 stories, the complete Optic Nerve mini-comics. And then from there, once he started to be published by Drawn and Quarterly, I think it's about every 3 issues of Optic Nerve, he would then collect them in book form. So far we've had Sleepwalk and Other Stories, Summer Blonde, Shortcomings, and now Killing and Dying. And with the exception of Shortcomings, all of these collections are individual stories. And, as you pointed out, we have 6 different short pieces that make up Killing and Dying.
Right, although he's done some other things as well, like because for a while I had gotten out of the Tomine habit. For the first, like when he was doing Optic Nerve as a mini, I was following along with that, and then eventually just kind of fell by the wayside. But a couple years ago, I picked up Scenes from an Impending Marriage, which was a little standalone one-shot hardcover that he did, which was kind of like a humorous look at preparing to get married, which I loved. And it was in a much different kind of more simple kind of cartoony style that he'd used before, and I just thought it was one of the funniest and cutest, in the best sense of the word, things I'd read in a long time.
Yeah, now he's had that as well as other books that don't fall within the Optic Nerve family, I guess. For instance, Scenes from an Impending Marriage, New York Drawings, and he's got a scrapbook collection that came out in, I think, 2004. But with Optic Nerve, that's what he's best known for. And these come out, I don't know, usually about every 2 years. It's not often. I know that what we have in Killing and Dying collects issues 12, 13, and 14 of Optic Nerve, which came out in 2011, 2013, and 2015 earlier this year, those last 3 issues. But, what he'll do is he'll collect, I guess, the 3 issues into collections. Now, Shortcomings was different in that the 3 Optic Nerve issues that ultimately made up Shortcomings is one long story, or I guess what we could call a graphic novel, if you like that term. But the other collections, Sleepwalk and Summer Blonde, just as Killing and Dying, are individual story collections. And I don't know about you, but one of the things I was trying to do with Killing and Dying is to find some kind of connection among the 6 in some way. I don't know if it's necessarily there. I could speculate on what may be some kind of connective tissue among some of the stories, but I don't necessarily think that he was writing these. In the same case with Sleepwalk and also Summer Blonde, I don't think he was writing these to be some kind of interlinked cycle narrative of any sort.
Oh no, not if it's there. It was unapparent to me, and I never even thought to look for something like that because I just approached it as a collection of short stories. And since every one is kind of graphically different as well as thematically different, it just really feels like a collection, and I've got no problem with a collection.
Oh yeah. I don't either. But what made me think about the interconnectedness is that on the cover of Killing and Dying, we have what was originally in issue number. I think it was 13 of Optic Nerve, and that is from the story translated from the Japanese, and it's a scene of a Denny's. Now, so Denny's appears in this story translated from the Japanese, but there's also a reference to a Denny's in one other story, and I think that may be Go Owls. And so I was trying to look, okay, if there's a Denny's in every story, then maybe the Denny's is a connection, but that's not the case. But I do think that there is some kind of pattern, intended or otherwise, going on in this book, Killing and Dying, because we have 6 stories. So the first one is a brief history of the art form known as horticulture, which is great. I look forward to talking about that. And then there's Amber Sweet, Go Owls, translated from the Japanese, Killing and Dying, and then Intruders. And these are in the order that they originally appeared in issues 12 to 14 of Optic Nerve. Now, every other story, Amber Sweet, translated from the Japanese, and Intruders, are the stories that were the second within each issue of Optic Nerve, 12, 13, and 14. One of the things that each of these 3 stories have in common is they're each in the first person. And you could also make the argument that each of them are somewhat like confessionals.
True.
Of some sort. That's the only connection I found among, at least overt connection, among any of these stories. I don't know what to make of it, but I do think it's an interesting pattern that we see here. Again, intended or otherwise.
I hadn't really noticed the switching back and forth between third and first person narration. Possibly it's variety, possibly it's a pattern. I don't really know.
You know, maybe I don't know about along with this, but if every other story, the second one of each original issue of Optic Nerve, is a first person, somewhat confessional, if we want to call it that, they also have in common quite serious overtone. And in other words, there's not much that's humorous in any of those 3 stories. On the other hand, A Brief History of the Art Form known as Horticulture, Go Owls, and Killing and Dying, those are funny stories, or at least bittersweet narratives.
Yeah, though I think that I don't think I could separate them quite that way, because I see a lot of mix. I see a big mix in almost all of them. You know, like Amber Sweet feels there's a lot of weird humor in that as well.
True. I'm not saying that it's a clear-cut, funny, serious. Yeah. It's just that there's really I don't see as much humor in Amber Sweet, I guess, as you do.
Right.
It's an unusual premise, and I think that may be where some of the humor could be embedded. But in stories like, the horticulture story, the Go Owls especially, maybe to a lesser degree, Killing and Dying, I mean, those have outright funny moments. With Killing and Dying, literally jokes.
Right, although I find that possibly the saddest story in the collection.
It is. And I think that's one of the things that makes that one of the strongest pieces in this collection. Arguably the strongest, and maybe we can discuss and or debate that. But now, what did you think of the first story, A Brief History of the Art Form known as Horticulture?
Okay, well, first thing I got to say the word peanuts, because clearly he's riffing on peanuts here from the get go. Because the structure of this story, it's a series of 4-panel gag strips. And you got six 4-panel strips followed by basically a sundae.
Right.
And so
that's in color. The rest of them are in black and white.
The other ones are in black and white, and each one has horticulture at the top in a little black box, just like Peanuts used to have Peanuts for a long time. So visually, he's riffing on kind of the newspaper comic strip format to tell a very non-newspaper comic strip story.
It's weird.
It's weird. Yeah, it's about a gardener who gets an idea for a new kind of art form, or he considers it a new kind of art form, and how his kind of artistic obsessions start to rule and ruin his family life.
Exactly. And in this new kind of art form that he calls horticulture, it's a mix between horticulture and sculpture, as the name suggests. And so what he does is he puts these, what is it? Some kind of, it looks like metal casings, or some kind of casings around live flora. And he is trying to sell them as art. And the thing is, he wants people to buy his art. At the same time, though, they have to hire him to keep up the horticulture piece because it grows. In fact, it literally is living art. And so as the plant part continues to grow, he'll have to come out every now and again and cut it back. Of course, that sounds ridiculous, right? Because you buy a work of quote-unquote art from him, and then you have to pay him to come out to your place on a regular basis and keep it trimmed. It seems ridiculous, but he's serious. I mean, the main character, Harold, he's not a con man here. He's very passionate.
Very serious.
He is very serious, very passionate about his art, but he just cannot see how ridiculous that this seems to other people. And of course, that's a big part of the humor.
Yeah, although it's strange because it's a little bit like it's kind of like buying a license to the art as well that you have to keep up your monthly subscription to. It's kind of a Netflix model of art, which I actually kind of like that. It's actually
social commentary.
It's actually very kind of 21st century, going back to like getting dirty with the art, but at the same time trying to find a way to make your art pay, which is not I think what he starts off doing, but he realizes that for the concept to work, there's got to be this cash flow,
right?
And so it's an interesting way to kind of really kind of make concrete the idea of the life of an artist and actually being a artist who can actually afford to eat and have a family and a house and things like that. Because again, he's got a wife and a daughter also, and the money situation gets more. The deeper he gets into his art, the more dire the money situation gets at home.
That's right. Now, it's funny that you immediately were drawn to Peanuts. I didn't think specifically of Schultz's Peanuts when I read this. I just thought, I guess, of newspaper strips in a broad, more general way.
Yeah, I did. But, well, again, I thought of Peanuts just because it's very, very clear from the repeated unwavering 4-panel structure, which is how Peanuts started at the beginning, and that black box giving the title of the strip at the beginning of every single strip. That's very much of a Peanuts thing. Yeah,
well, I mean, many Sunday, in fact, even arguably most Sunday, or not just Sunday, but newspaper strips are that 4-box format. But you are right. I guess the font of the title of the Sunday, the color full-page strip that says horticulture all the way across does have a Peanuts-esque look to it.
Yeah, even more so the black and white ones to me, though. That just looks so much more like the Peanuts to me, even. But again, I'm trained to see Peanuts everywhere. It's in my DNA.
Well, that's one of the things you were thankful for on our Thanksgiving episode is the Fantagraphics reprints, the nice packaging of the Peanut strips.
Yeah, and just I was curious. It was interesting also just kind of the rhythm that he uses in telling the story as well, because again, it looks like a series of daily strips, but sometimes you'll have that again. There's like a box of 4 panels at the top of the page and a box of 4 at the bottom for every black and white page you've got there. And sometimes there's a jump in time between the first strip and the second strip, and sometimes there's absolutely no time jumped at all. So sometimes it reads as two separate strips, and sometimes it reads as just a full page. But it's visually separated into two strips itself.
Right. Just as we would see in newspaper strips. I mean, sometimes there were stories continued, usually within a week's period, right? Usually during the weekdays, Monday through Friday. But sometimes not. So I like that format of telling this story, a brief history of the art form known as horticulture. And it's interesting to note that not only does he not use this same strategy in any of the other stories in this collection, but it's safe to say that many of the stories in Killing and Dying are told in very different formats.
Right. And one thing that I always thought of with him when he first started out, he felt a little like some you can tell who somebody's hero is, and for him, clearly Dan Clowes seemed to be his hero from early on.
Right.
And he's kind of developed in a similar way, but it doesn't feel like Clowes anymore. It looks a little more like Clowes because Clowes has been doing a lot of things where experimenting with different formats within the same story and things like that. And this book, just as you flip through it, you see a lot of different visual formats, often hearkening back to old comic strips or old comic books as you go through it. And there's a superficial resemblance to what Clowes' work looks like a bit, but I don't feel like he's really become his own artist at this point. Whereas for a while it felt like he was trying to be Clowes to a certain extent. I don't feel that at all anymore. Even though there's some visual and even some thematic stuff, because there's some people in these stories are not really enjoyable people, and that's kind of become a Clowes trademark as well. But that's not. I don't hate the people in his stories as much as I hate almost everybody in Clowes' most recent work.
It's funny that you mentioned Clowes for a couple of reasons. When I was rereading these stories, because I had read them originally when the Optic Nerve issues came out, and by the way, I don't think we mentioned that Killing and Dying came out back in October, so we're just now getting around to this. We're a little late. But in going back and rereading these stories, I was thinking of two other creators who just immediately came to mind. Clowes was one, and then Seth was another. And one of the reasons why I'm putting the three of these people together is they're three artists that deal with more realistic kinds of storytelling in ways that you won't find in, I think, comics as a whole. I mean, there are examples of this out there, but I think with both Tomine, Clowes, and Seth, they're consistent, almost all consistent. Clowes has done some things that are a little fantastical at times, but for the most part, these three creators deal with more realistic, real life stories, and so I think that gets back to what you were talking about with characterization. When you're dealing with real life stories, in many ways, you're dealing with people who are complex, conflicted, and not all good and not all bad. So of course, there are going to be parts that are unattractive, and I'm thinking immediately of the father in the story Killing and Dying. On the one hand, we can empathize with what he's going through, but on the other hand, they're just parts of him. Yeah. They're parts that, I mean, I don't know if I'd use the word prick, but there are things that he does that I really dislike or that leave me very uncomfortable. But he's doing what he's doing, or appearing prick-ish, I guess, out of love. And it may be misguided, but he's doing it for his daughter. And so I think it's this kind of storytelling that that at least for me puts Tomine in the same league as Clowes and Seth. Another thing that I thought about in terms of Clowes, it occurred to me after I had that original thought of the realistic kind of storytelling, since we've been doing this podcast, Daniel Clowes has not published anything. And but that's going to change next year because his new book, I think it's called Patience.
I think so. I've heard something about it, yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be coming out from Fantagraphics, and so I'm really looking forward to that. It's going to be an occasion to celebrate, but for now we're celebrating with Tomine's Killing and Dying. What story stood out for you in this collection?
Hortisculpture, for me, I like that one a lot. They're all interesting. I'm not sure anything else really stands out in the same way. Just flipping through here. Nothing else super stands out for me so much. They're all very. I found them all to be actually quite different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's one of the gems of this book, and I think Tomine's writing as a whole is you can go through these collections of his stories, or even individual issues of Optic Nerve, and you can see that he's not doing the same thing over and over again. I mean, he is telling more realistically real life based stories, however you want to describe it, but they have different perspectives, different points of view, different narrators. They're coming from different angles and sometimes very different styles, as we were talking about earlier with the Hortisculpture comic. I really liked, in terms of humor, even more than Hortisculpture, is Go Owls. Just because the character, the main guy, Dennis Barry, is just so ridiculous. I mean, he's an ass in more ways than one.
Yeah, it starts off kind of in a 12-step program, and if anybody needs one and needs the kind of support that can give you, it's him, but he doesn't seem to take it very seriously. And he seems to have a couple different kind of addictions. One of them is, again, being a manipulative asshole.
Yeah.
And it starts off funny, and it just gets more and more sad. You can start to see it coming, and once the big turn hits in his relation in the two main characters' relationship, it's just this one made me probably more uncomfortable than any other story in the book.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I think, though, that I felt much more uncomfortable reading Killing and Dying because the woman in Go Owls, the one that he meets at this 12-step meeting, and I don't know if her name is ever used. I couldn't.
Yeah, there's a lot of names a lot of characters that don't seem to have a lot of names in these stories.
Right. But the woman in Go Owls, and you mentioned the turn at the end, and we won't give it away, but I think this is a great, almost like punchline in Go Owls. What happens at the end, and we see her, I don't know, I got the sense that she's okay. She may be a little surprised and put off, but she's going to turn out okay. In other words, I don't worry about where she's going to end up. Whereas the people in Killing and Dying, especially the father, I just kind of wonder what's going to happen to him.
Possibly, although she sticks around with the situation much longer than she should have.
You're talking about the woman in Go Owls?
In Go Owls, right, yeah.
Yeah, so,
it ends on a semi-positive note, and yeah, there's a few turns in the story. But she's on her own at the end, and you'd like to think she's going to be okay, but at the same time, she let herself. She didn't get out of that relationship, and there were so many warning signs that she should not have been there. But again, she clearly needs support as well, and she thought she was getting it from him, and he was not the one. Exactly.
So that, if we want to psychologize, it tells us something about what kind of person she may be and what kind of help she may need. I think this is another hallmark of Tomine storytelling, and that is the equivocal ending, the ambiguity. He never ends, or I would say maybe rarely ends, one of his narratives with anything even approximating neatness. It's, again, a more real life, and I hesitate to say slice of life, but kind of a real life kind of storytelling, because in our own lives, there really is no closure or resolution or neatly tied ends to whatever's going on with us, right? Same thing with these stories. And I think in every single one of these, we don't have anything that's ultimately resolved. We're just left at the end of the story, and that's it. We don't know what happens to the unnamed female character in Go Owls. We don't know what happens with this narrator who has written a note and translated from the Japanese, or the soldier on leave between duties in Intruders. It just ends. And I like that. I hate stories with nice, neat endings unless the nice, neat ending is part of the message, and I get a sense that the artist is conscious of that and is using that in a certain way. I would much rather be left wondering, okay, what's going on? What's going to happen to this character? How should I read the situation? I don't know how I feel about it. That to me is great storytelling.
I'd agree to a certain extent. Sometimes, if everything's an enigma, then it starts to become. It almost feels like it's a crutch. Like is it an enigmatic ending, or do you just not know how to end a story? Like horticulture actually has horticulture actually has a clear end.
You're right there,
which I liked because it kind of and it fit in with the main character as well. He's this kind of indefatigable guy who's kind of got the world beaten down on him, but he's always trying to find a way. And it looks like in that one he seems to have found a way, which is maybe not what he would have chosen, but it seems to work for him. But the other ones, yeah, are much more enigmatic.
Yeah, you made two good points. One, that of the stories in Killing and Dying, it is the horticulture one that does seem to have some sense of closure. And it's a comedic ending without giving anything away. But I think that goes to the nature of that style. In other words, how we were discussing that horticulture was told in this kind of newspaper strip-ish way. And so it just makes sense that this ends with almost a punchline, if you will. Mm-hmm. And you're also right in that with ambiguous endings, it could be that someone doesn't know how to end a story. I really don't see that as the case with Tomine, though.
I don't either.
Yeah. Now, I'm a sucker for ambiguity, especially when it comes to the endings of narratives. Even stories that seem to have a nice, neat ending ultimately don't. And a great example of that is Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, where, most people, I think, read that as Huck saying, everything turned out okay. I tried to go back, to the Widow Douglas's, but didn't work. I'm heading off to the territories. I'll see you later. And that's Huck. Well, it's kind of a sad ending, really, because civilization is where he's heading to, and he can't live in civilization, as he tells us at the end. So it's kind of a sad story, and he doesn't know that it's going to follow him. And I use that as an example, not just to bring up one of my heroes, Mark Twain, but just to point out that even when something seems to be neatly tied, there's a lot of openness to that. And that's what I appreciate in storytelling. Some people don't like it. I know many times when I teach works of fiction, students like a neat ending. They like closure, and they're uncomfortable with equivocalness. But with me, that I love those kind of stories.
Yeah, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Because I don't know. Sometimes I got a higher tolerance for ambiguity than others. I like stories that make my head hurt, but I don't like stories that feel like they don't know what they're doing. And sometimes I feel that. Again, I don't feel that way with these stories at all in this book.
There definitely is a sense of mastery with Tomine's form of storytelling. And I think that mastery comes into sharp focus in one of the center stories of this collection, and that is translated from the Japanese.
Oh, yeah, that one is enigmatic kind of from the get-go, especially because just from the visual style, it's kind of like very large panels with first-person narrative blocks over it, and you don't really get even images of characters once you get parts of characters. You get an arm or the top of a head or something like that. You don't really see you see context, but you don't really see characters as much, which is it's not your normal comic storytelling mode.
Right. You never see full faces. You may see faces askew. In fact, the most we see of any kind of face, if you want to call it that, is a stuffed doll.
Right, that's the only kind of a three-quarter profile we get at all.
Yeah, exactly. And so, this is a story that's told from the first person, and it's in a letter. At least I get a sense that this is a letter written by a mother to her child, I guess son, from all hints of the story. And I thought
it was a daughter.
Or is it a daughter?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Okay. See, now we're going to have to go back and... Well, we don't have to, but... That's interesting. I assumed it was a son, but who knows? But it's a mother writing a letter to her child. Let's just say that. And it is years after the fact, and she's remembering an event where she and the child fly back to the United States, back to, I guess, San Francisco is where it is, from Japan, which is where she had been living, and that's actually where she and her family are from. And it's not said outright, although it's hinted at, but that the woman who is the narrator writing this note to her child had married someone from the United States, but had, for whatever reason, and again, there's a lot we don't know about the backstory here, not much exposition at all. She had been living in Japan with her family, and much to her family's chagrin, she's coming back to the United States, and this story is recalling that experience of flying back and returning to San Francisco and the initial day or so of her arrival.
Yeah, it's this story was really enigmatic, and it felt like it was getting half of somebody's thoughts, and you almost feel embarrassed reading it because it seems so hurtful and so there's so much kind of longing in the words that are there, just the kind of empty images that are in there. It was a little hard to read.
Yeah, and you're right. There is a lot of empty space in this story, and the way that it ends. I mean, you're talking about ambiguity. I mean, I'm looking at the very last page of this story. It ends with the woman saying or writing, "I wonder how old you are now as you read this. How long have I been gone? Do you remember anything of our time over there when we were starting a different, unknowable life? Can you believe that your parents once came so close to breaking?" And even that last passage is packed with ambiguity. So, for instance, when she writes, "Do you remember anything of our time over there when we were starting a different, unknowable life?" Now, does she mean when they came back to San Francisco or when they were over there in Japan? Where is the there in that statement?
Right.
I mean, even that's unclear.
Yeah, the whole thing is very unclear, and I think it seems to speak at least a bit to regrets in the narrator's own regrets for the way life has turned out or hasn't turned out.
Right. And, that is one of my favorite stories in this collection. But I think Killing and Dying is really the standout. And not just because it's the title story, but as you pointed out earlier, it's probably one of the saddest.
Yeah, although again, like the translator from Japanese is also pretty damn sad. I may have to rethink that. I mean, there is a lot of sadness in this book.
Right, but because in translated from the Japanese, we don't see someone dying. And even though we don't see that literally in Killing and Dying, we see someone in the process of it. And that, to me, is what makes this story so sad, especially when it's juxtaposed to the very act of telling jokes. Because the young woman, the teenager, Jessica, in this story, wants to be a stand-up comedian. She wants to be an improv artist. She wants to tell jokes. She's someone who is awkward. She doesn't feel like she's secure. She stutters. And so she, as the story begins, she tells her parents that she may want maybe to take a class, at a learning annex or something like that on stand-up comedy. And, of course, the father's skeptical because he didn't think that she had much of a sense of humor. But more than anything, he wants to protect her from feeling even worse than she already does, being self-conscious about her lack of social skills, I guess, and especially the stuttering. So, and this is that character we were referencing earlier, right? The father, he is a prick, or he's kind of a prick kind of guy, but he does what he does, even though it's not the best, in order to look out for his daughter.
Yeah, right. And it's again, just stylistically, this is another different kind of book, different kind of story because just the layout. It's based on a grid of 20 panels per page.
Which
is really, really dense. It's a very dialogue heavy story. So it kind of works that way because there's a lot of back and forth between characters. So it works, but again, it's just visually very different from what's come before. I mean, even in American comics, a 9-panel page is looked as kind of overfull. This is super overfull, but again, it works because it is a very much of to a certain extent, a talking head sort of story.
Exactly. In fact, the closest we get to that kind of packed density when it comes to panels is Go Owls, and that's 12 panels for the most part per page. This is, as you mentioned, 20. So
yeah, and that the page 99 where again one thing I liked about the story was that again we're talking about enigmatic things that aren't really spoken of. As once I got to around when the daughter is doing her first stand-up gig with the class, suddenly we see the parents in the audience, and the mom is wearing a scarf, which she hadn't been wearing before, and suddenly I realized what was going on with mom. And that's because it's never mentioned in the story at all, really, until kind of after the fact. You see, and you flip the pages back, you see her hair getting shorter and things like that, and then she's wearing the scarf, and oh my God. There's a lot more happening in the story than just the daughter wanting to be a comedian. There's a lot more happening in this family that isn't getting addressed at all. And then you get to page 99, and suddenly panel 13 doesn't exist. And it's like, oh shit! I know exactly what happened in that little blank space, and it's a very small space. But because we're used to this very, very dense page, suddenly we've got this gap there, and that gap is really, really significant.
Right, and a couple of things that you mentioned there is worth focusing on a little more. You mentioned the mother, that once we see her in that headscarf, you realize that she's got cancer. And the first time I read this, I didn't notice that the mother's hair length after the first 2 or 3 pages gets noticeably shorter. I did not notice that at first until I saw the headscarf. And then, as you said, then you flip back and then you see this stuff. And then that 13th panel on page 99, you're right, it's kind of a blank space. He also does something interesting with blank space at the very end of this story, and this is on page 108.
Right.
On page 107 as well, there is a blank space, and again, that 13th panel. And so this is another kind of dying, I guess you could say. And without giving anything away, let's just say that this kind of dying is linked to Jessica's attempt at improv stand-up. At a club. But then the very last page of this story, now Tomine could have given us an entire page of 20 panels, as he does throughout most of this story, but he ends after only 2 strips. And then the rest of the page is just completely blank. And I think that just adds to the ambiguity of the way that this story ends. I mean, we don't know where Jessica and her father end up. We don't know what kind of relationship they'll have. We don't know how the death of the mother is going to affect them in any way, or what Jessica's stand-up career, if anything, is gonna be like. But
yeah, again, we've only got 8 panels on that page, and I screwed up before. It's not the 13th panel that's blank; it's the 9th panel. Just because I can't seem to count and talk at the same time.
Oh, 9th. Okay. Well, I could have counted that. I just went along with you. I said, okay, 13. Plus, it sounded appropriate, right? 13.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, that last panel, that last page there, we've just got the 2 tiers of 4 panels, and then like almost 2/3 of the page is just blank. Life goes on, but we're just kind of left hanging as to what's happening there, and they seem to end on a fairly positive note, even though the daughter is lying, the father knows the daughter is lying, but they need to go on.
Right. What did you make of the very last story of the collection, Intruders?
Intruders, that's a weird-ass story.
Yeah.
Number one, I keep going to the visual all the time. I like how sketchy it is compared to everything else. Again, it's not sloppy at all, but the artwork, the panels aren't... the panels aren't bordered. It looks a little more Alex Tothy, actually, which I like a lot. It's a little more stark in the kind of the use of using black ink and stuff like that, and just kind of floating text above it. The main character there's a nostalgia, but it's a really, really creepy nostalgia that this guy lives in, and clearly he's been damaged by his tours. Mm-hmm. In a way that he's trying to work through. He could use that 12-step program that the characters begin to use in Go Owls. He should be part of that group. He needs to be part of something like that because he's got a lot of unresolved stuff that he cannot seem to deal with.
Right. Now, it starts off, we learn that he is in the military, and he tells us that what takes place in the story happens between his second and third tours of duty. And we don't know a lot of what's gone on in his life. We know that he used to be... I don't know if it was married or involved with someone, but he had a relationship. Yeah, and they lived in an apartment, and he runs into someone one day, or they used to live in a certain apartment, and he runs into someone who did house sitting for them at one time.
Right.
And she, when she house sat, she was a teenager, I guess, and said, "Oh God, I haven't seen you in such a long time. And guess what? I never returned your keys." And so he gets these keys. He goes back to this place that he hasn't lived in a long time, and he stalks it. He breaks in.
Was it breaking it if you've got a key?
But it's not his.
Right.
He doesn't rent it. You're right. I mean, is it technically breaking in?
Yeah.
He doesn't break anything, or at least with the lock. And then he goes in. He fixes himself a meal, and he just sits there and thinks, and then he leaves. And he does this over, several day period.
Yeah, I'm a little unclear as to how long this is going on, but it goes on for a while.
Yeah.
Because he's able to develop a routine.
And that's creepy.
Oh, yeah.
So, I don't know what kind of action he saw overseas during one of maybe his first or second tour of duty. It may have addled him a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's really weird. But again, just like Amber Sweet and then translated from the Japanese, this is told in the first person. And it's also, in its own way, a kind of confessional, I would argue. And I think what's notable about this is, and Tomine tells us this at the very beginning, that he dedicates this to Yoshihiro Tatsumi. And I don't know if you're familiar with the works of Tatsumi.
No.
Tatsumi, Tatsumi died earlier this year. I think back in the spring, maybe around March or so. And Drawn and Quarterly is the English language publisher that has been bringing Tatsumi's books into print in English. And Tomine is the one who has edited and overseen this series of books from Tatsumi. And in fact, I think the very first one is called The Pushman and Other Stories. Tomine writes the introduction for that. And then in most, not all, of the other volumes, there are, at the end of these Tatsumi books, brief interviews between Tatsumi and Tomine. And so when he dedicates this story, Intruders, to Tatsumi, I'm wondering if this shift in style it's definitely not Tatsumi's style, but because it's such a noticeable difference from everything else in this book, I'm wondering if he just consciously altered his style to maybe be a little more reflective of Tatsumi than his other work. I don't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't begin to know how to answer that question.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if he wrote Intruders, because Intruders came out, was it back in the summer or the spring? I can't remember. But it came out like right after Tatsumi had died. So I don't know if he wrote this while Tatsumi was still alive. I don't know. No way of knowing.
Yeah.
So, now one story we haven't talked about much, except just in passing, and that is Amber Sweet. And this is another kind of weird scenario story, kind of like Intruders.
Yeah, it's a case of mistaken identity. Our main character, our narrator, starting in college, people have to look at her funny. She doesn't understand what's going on until she realizes that she's basically a dead ringer for a porn star.
Whose name is Amber Sweet.
Right.
Actually, it's kind of a good name for a porn star, I guess. And so it kind of screws up her life because people keep either assuming that she is that porn star. And so, the women may hold her at arm's length. And, of course, the guys, are wanting to talk with her, flirt with her. She can't even have a relationship because either it ends up screwing up whatever she could have had with the guy, or she learns at one point that the guy she's probably with because he has a thing for Amber Sweet, even though he knows she's not Amber Sweet.
Right.
So it's a rather twisted story.
Yeah, and well, it's a twisted situation. The story itself is interesting because
yeah.
Yeah, it's a little hard to talk about because it's really well done, and I'm not quite sure where you go at the end. She's still trying to. It looks like she's still trying to process this stuff. She seems to be past it, but not entirely. She still needs to talk about it because who wouldn't? Because this it's a really messed up thing to have happen to your life. Because we get enough incidents where clearly the idea that the people mistake her for this porn star just follows her along, and she cannot shake it. Finally, cutting her hair is the thing that sort of does it, but even if it stops happening outwardly, it's still happening inwardly in her mind. She can't stop thinking about it. Right.
Now we see her in the final panels, especially on the last page of the story. Her hair has gotten a little longer, and even though we don't see her face on this final page, I get a sense that she is coming to grips with this, and if not coming to a resolution, at least feeling a little better about trying to understand what this has meant for her in her life. Now, how this ends, and it is many ways how this story begins, because when we look at the first page, this is 33, the big panel that takes up the first half of that page is a sky, clouds in the sky, in the words, "This isn't the easiest thing for me to talk about, but I need to just get it out there. Otherwise, it'll hang over me, and then it'll get even weirder when I try to bring it up later. Okay?" And at first, you think that she is talking to the reader. Again, kind of a confessional. And then she tells us this story. Then when we get to the very end, we see the same kind of clouds that take up the panel. The last thing she says, "Anyway, sorry for talking your ear off, but I thought I should tell you about all that. I mean, just in case." And then the very last panel, which takes up the bottom half of page 43, you see that she's sitting on a hillside with some other guy or some guy, and he responds, "Okay." So this entire story had been her tale or confession to him about this Amber Sweet event in her life and how it had so much meaning and defines her in some ways, but she needs to get that out of the way.
Right, so I'm guessing it's early in the relationship, even if it is a relationship, but it's early in her dealing with this other person.
Exactly, and I love that kind of narrative scenario that Tomine sets up in Amber Sweet, but we don't know that it's that particular kind of setup until we get to the very end of the story.
Right.
And so that just adds to the sweetness of what he's doing.
Yeah, and it's for a lot of these stories, these are, like most good literature, it really helps to reread things. Once you've read it through the first time, the second time you go through it, you start to see the connections that are there, that things that seem to be throwaway or don't seem to matter much at the beginning really are significant, but you really get them as you reread stuff. So that's, for me, that's a mark of something that's worthwhile, is that it's not just read it once and you're done with it. It really rewards going back and spending more time with the stories.
Exactly. Now, I didn't know this until Killing Dying actually came out, because this is in the back of the book with the acknowledgments and all that. I mean, obviously, as we stated earlier, that the stories here were parts of issues 12, 13, and 14 of Optic Nerve. But an earlier and very different version of Amber Sweet, it didn't even have that title, apparently appeared in Kramer's Ergo number 7. Now, are you familiar with that?
I don't have that issue, so I haven't seen it, so I don't really know what the differences might be.
Yeah, and I think issue 7 is that notoriously hyper-expensive volume, and yeah, I definitely don't have that one. I was hoping that you had seen this earlier version of what's now called Amber Sweet, because I'm curious how different it is.
Me too, yeah, but I just never hadn't gotten around to that.
Yeah. You know, before we leave and move on to the other comics, there's one thing that's notable about Killing and Dying, and that is it doesn't include everything in Optic Nerve 12, 13, and 14. Because in all three of those issues, there were small strips, depending on the issue, either 2 pages or 1 page worth, of autobiographical comics autobiographical, the character was Tomine himself. And more than anything, they're kind of he's making fun of himself and his, him thinking that he is this creative celebrity where he's not, or he comes across in one strip as this social media curmudgeon. And it's him poking fun at himself. And on the one hand, I'm kind of sorry that those comics aren't in Killing and Dying. On the other hand, I think it's good that he includes these comics in the individual comic book issues, but not in the collection, because you have to go back and get the comic. I mean, it says that you need to get these issues of Optic Nerve when they come out and not just wait for the book every few years.
So I'm missing that because I don't have any recent issues of Optic Nerve at all.
Oh, they're definitely worth checking out. So, but I think there's about a total of 4 pages of these autobiographical stories that were in the original issues of Optic Nerve but are not collected in Killing and Dying. So get Killing and Dying, go back and get those issues of Optic Nerve, and you'll be all set.
Nice.
Okay, you want to move on to Taddle Creek number 36.
Okay, and this one, now, where did this one come from? You were contacted by the editor?
Actually, this is funny. Now, I did not know about Taddle Creek, and the editor of this magazine is Conan Tobias. And if you want to find out more about Taddle Creek, you can look it up. Go to Taddle Creek Mag. That's TaddleCreekMag.com. Not Tattle. It's Taddle, Taddle. I recently did an interview with Megs Fitzgerald. She had a book recently, Long Red Hair. So I was talking with her about that. And at one point in our conversation, I think this was toward the end, I can't even remember now if this was in our recorded conversation or if this came up in the back and forth we had, after we recorded. But anyway, she had said something about she had contributed a piece to Taddle Creek and was looking forward to that coming out. And I said, "Oh, what's Taddle Creek?" And she told me that it's this magazine, this kind of literary/cultural magazine out of Canada that this next issue that just recently came out, 36, is all comics. Because not all of these issues include comics, but this is an all comics issue. But she said she had a piece coming out, and so after that conversation, I did a little investigation, found their website, and got in touch with Conan Tobias and told him that we may be interested in discussing Taddle Creek 36 on the podcast. And very helpful, very enthusiastic about sending us review copies of the magazine.
Yeah, it's a really good anthology. I enjoyed reading this a heck of a lot. There's a huge variety of stuff in here, just in terms of length, style, kind of story focus and stuff. You got lots of different genres are there. I mean, it's mostly kind of slice stuff, but not entirely. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of other. There's some mythic stuff as well. And everything is just really beautifully drawn too.
Right, and sci-fi comedy, because one of my favorite pieces is a one-page comic, Post-Humans, and this is by Dakota McFadzean.
Right.
And I love the work of Dakota. And this is a story where these two people are walking down the street, and these two aliens are kind of floating above them. It says, "Greetings, you are humans. We are post-humans from the distant future." And then they start describing what the distant future is all about. And it doesn't seem very attractive. And toward the end, the woman that they're talking to says, "Okay, we get it. We won't be able to enjoy the future, but our descendants will, right?" And she's obviously angry. And then the aliens kind of shrug, and then they change their story. We're also from a different universe. Yeah, it really is a superior universe, and they kind of go off. So, I mean, it's got a great, Dakota has a great sense of humor, and so that's just one of the many great contributions in issue number 36 of Taddle Creek. Now, some of these names I recognize, and people whose work I've been following for quite a while, like, for instance, Noah Van Sciver. In fact, he opens this collection with a story called Home.
Right.
That is rather autobiographical, because, you and I talked not too long ago about that autobiographical comic of his, My First Date, or My Hot Date.
Right, yeah, exactly. And this is a little bit of it's done in that same kind of watercolor style as well. Mm-hmm. Which I love. And it's only a short 3-page story talking about the place he's lived in the past few years. And just it's kind of it's slice of life, really, in the fact that this is just a slice of stuff, and he's right in the middle of what's happening. But I love the kind of parallels in between the gigantic first panel where he's sitting in a place that he just moved into, or just moving out of, looking at us, and then the last panel he's sitting in the forest, I guess in Vermont, where he just moved to, right, talking to us again. We just in between, he's kind of telling us what's been going on just in his life, kind of focusing on where he actually is physically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and his problems of the past several years of finding a place to call home, that he tells us in the story, he hopes to, at some point in life, get to a point where he can put down roots and have a place to stay where he can unpack things for a long time. But as you point out, in that very first panel, we see that he's in a place where we see boxes that are yet unpacked.
Right.
Or maybe just freshly packed.
Yeah, it's unclear, and it doesn't. I'm not sure that it matters much, but it's just
Right.
it's just clearly this is somebody in transition.
Right.
And it's all about the story is all about transition. So to call it home is really kind of nicely ironic, because it's the home is the goal, not rather than rather where he is at this moment.
Right. Now, many, and maybe most of these contributors to issue number 36 of Taddle Creek are Canadian creators, but not all of them. And Noah Van Sciver is one example of a non-Canadian. But I think a lot of the people, at least whose names I recognize, are Canadian creators, like Megs Fitzgerald, like Dakota McFadzean, like Joe Ullman. And in fact...
Maurice Villacoup.
Yes, David Collier.
Right.
Is another one. Although Michael DeForge, though, now is Michael DeForge? I can't remember. Is he Canadian?
I don't know.
Not that it makes a difference, but but I don't know. I have a thing for Canadian artists, and maybe I idealize them too much. But I'm always fascinated every time I pick up a comic from a Canadian creator. But getting back to Joe Ullman, he has a 4-page comic called Old Joe Ullman Needs to Make a Comic. And I mean, I love him. Are you familiar with Joe Ullman's work?
I am not.
Oh, God. Oh, you have to check him out. He's got a great sense of humor. And he's another one of these creators, like Adrian Tomine, who, for the most part, not completely, tends to tell these more realistically based narratives. Although his book Science Fiction is about alien abduction, so I guess that's not realistic, depending on who you talk to.
What do you mean?
But his stories also, like Tomine's, end ambiguously for the most part, and also he tends to privilege the short story form over the long, more novelistic kind of storytelling. And here we have, I think, Joe Ullman at his best when it comes to this kind of self-conscious, self-aware humor, because basically this is a 4-page comic, especially in the first couple of pages, where he's very much aware of himself as a cartoonist who has promised Conan Tobias 4 pages for an issue of Taddle Creek, but he doesn't know what to do. So he falls on kind of a safe backup. He says, hey, I'll do an autobiographic comic. And he kind of makes fun, in a nice way, of autobiographic comics,
right,
at the same time that he's making one. And one of the things I love is at the very bottom of this first page, when he decides to do a comic based on a recent experience he's had, he says, I'll do it, a diary comic about a road trip with my mother-in-law. And at the very bottom of that page, there's a little image of him, and he's looking out at the reader, and he says, and that is how you use diary comics to kill a page. And he's pointing to number 1, that first page of the story. He says, bam. It's kind of a funny story that he takes with his wife and his mother-in-law, but I think the premise, him saying, I've got to do a story, I don't know what to do, hey, I'll do a diary story. A lot of people get mileage out of that. Why don't I do that? Just adds to the humor.
Yeah, and it's one of those kind of it's acutely self-aware, because
right,
he tells a story about his mother-in-law, and he acknowledges that mother-in-law jokes are a dime a dozen, but this one's real. And also his wife, and therefore his mother-in-law, is Chinese, and he realized that dealing with ethnic stereotypes is difficult, but this is real. And he's walking kind of a tightrope with what he's doing, and I think it works.
Yeah. It definitely does. So this was one of the standout stories for me in this issue, but about everything is a standout, really.
Yeah, it was all a lot of fun. Where's the story? I'm just flipping through here. The Village Under the Clouds by Megs Fitzgerald. It's a kind of it's not exactly science fiction, but it's not. It's more. It reads more as a kind of like a folk. Not even a folktale, but like a myth,
almost like a semi-creation myth in a way.
It's a semi-creation myth with people, a village on a planet not unlike the Earth, and visually this is just absolutely freaking beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a mix of like lush pen and ink work, and almost to the effect where it looks like woodcuts in some places,
mm-hmm,
and it's kind of a muted kind of a various tan and brown tones all the way through, and it ends with a kind of a nod, almost like the Clive Barker stories In the Hills, the Cities, where everybody in the village climbs onto each other's shoulders and they make a gigantic person which is made out of people, and they go to confront the kind of second tier gods who have taken over, because the first gods got tired of their duties, so they just took off. So then these kind of inferior gods take over instead, and they are not the best gods in the world. And
right.
so the villagers take it upon themselves that we're going to go up and figure out what's going on, and it ends ambiguously, but I like it a lot. It's really poetic and just beautiful.
Exactly. And if you love the style, then you definitely should check out her book from a couple of months ago, Long Red Hair.
I've heard of it, but I haven't seen a copy of it yet.
Yeah. That's a standout story. There was, some of these creators I was not aware of. So, for instance, I think I have seen this individual's work before. I don't know the last name or the first name, but Kiefer. Kiefer did Old Man Coyote and Iktomi and his wife in What's for Dinner.
Right. Yeah. It's the longest story in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it looks a little almost like Jay Hostler or something like that. Maybe just because the two of the main characters seem like they're almost like gigantic insect people, sort of, just because they seem to have 8 limbs.
Right.
But it's also kind of a it's more of a folktale because you've got Coyote, who's a trickster, but it turns out that the wife is kind of the most trickster of all the characters.
Yes. And I know that I've seen Kiefer's work somewhere before, but I can't recall where.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. If there's one thing I wish this would have had, would be like just a one page, like either like a table of contents or information about the contributors, because that's one thing we don't get here. And there's not even a list of like who's in it, and some of the signatures are kind of really small and hard to read in places. But I would love to see more attention paid to the creators themselves. I mean, there's great stuff in here, but I wish that the magazine could have told us who they were a little more.
Yeah, and in fact, if you want to find out who the creators are unambiguously, you have to go to the website. So it's Jason Kiefer. He's the artist behind What's for Dinner. But you're right. With some of these comics, you don't have full names of who these people are. Sometimes you do, though. But I swear I've seen Kiefer's work somewhere before. I just can't recall.
It looks familiar, and I can't tell if it's just because it's reminiscent of somebody else or if I've actually seen the specific cartoonist's work somewhere before.
Yeah. Now, I was really excited to see an excerpt from Nina Bunyevik's Fatherland 2.
Yeah, that was haunting as all get out.
Now, did you read Fatherland that came out early this year?
I did not.
Oh, God. Oh. It's a great book, and in fact, you have to go back to listen to, I think it was back in January that Kunka and I reviewed it, Fatherland. But it's a very moving book, and I knew that a follow-up, a sequel to Fatherland would be coming out, but I didn't know that there would be an excerpt of it in Taddle Creek, so this is good to see.
Yeah, the black and white kind of a really densely crosshatched work is beautiful, and the story itself, even the few pages that we get, is just absolutely freaking devastating.
Mm-hmm. Another creator that I don't think I've seen the work of, at least I don't recognize, is Maurice Velicoop. That one-pager Sexperience. Oh, you don't
know Velicoop? Oh God! He did he was big in Drawn and Quarterly in the 90s. They did a collection of his stuff called Velavision. I'm trying to remember what the name of his series was. He did something he did an anthology called Fabulous Babes, but he had his own book as well, and it's killing me that I cannot remember because I love his stuff. He's done it's kind of a very very flamboyantly gay work in a lot of places. Again, he's in a book called Fabulous Babes, which kind of tells you that. But his style is just very very lush. And this is kind of like one of the more rough things that I've seen him do. And again, it's very slick compared to most people, but it might just be the pulpy paper itself. But
yeah, we haven't mentioned that this is definitely magazine unglossy pulp kind of paper, which I think adds to this collection.
Yeah, right. It's not glossy, and I would prefer to have comics on this paper, like almost like 100% of the time, anyways.
Yeah, and if I probably have seen the work of Velikut before, but again, it's been so long. If I have, I cannot remember. But not all of the comics in this issue of Taddle Creek are brand new, because we have Fred Kelly's The New Adventures of Doc Stern as Mr. Monster.
Right, yeah, and this is strange because if you're familiar with Michael T. Gilbert's Doc Stern, Mr. Monster, it's kind of a takeoff or an extension of these old stories.
Right. So this is the earliest. This is the first incarnation of Mr. Monster, and apparently, according to this first page, they're going to come out with a collection of Kelly's Doc Stern Mr. Monster comics. The publisher seems to be. This is coming out next year. It says Comic Syrup Press.
Right. Yeah, and it's weird seeing it in black and white as well, because it almost looks like an underground or alternative comic. I think just because it was probably originally done just so quickly, and with the color would make it look a little not necessarily more slick, but not quite as undergroundy as it is, because it has kind of almost a outsider underground art style to it.
Right. Well, this is a Canadian comic back in the 1940s. So
yeah.
1946 is when this was originally published. So I think that's an interesting addition to everything else in here, because you get a little bit of the old and a lot of the new.
Yeah, and I really want to mention the All New Comics History by James and David Collier, which was a Jam comic. David Collier I love. I don't know if James is a brother or a father or something.
Yeah, it does.
It certainly looks like a lot like when Robert Crumb and Aileen Kaminsky Crumb do a Jam comic. It's the same kind of energy.
Yeah. I would guess that this is a son, because on the first page it says featuring the greatest generation gap. And so the two characters in this. Now, the characters themselves, you have a generation gap. There's Chubbo Wubbo and Chad the Lad. Well, why couldn't Chubbo Wubbo and Chad the Lad be David Collier and James Collier?
Except that Chad the Lad seems to be drawn by David.
Right, exactly. But still, if this is a father-son team, I mean, they could mix it up. I mean, I have no idea who James Collier is.
Yeah,
you're right.
I
love the work of David Collier. I just wish we had more David Collier. I mean, because it's not often that he comes out with anything, at least that I know of.
Yeah, I've seen a couple reference to a couple things recently, but I don't wind up seeing it in stores that much, I suppose. But I'm just not positive. I follow almost nobody close enough to know every single thing that comes out from them. But yeah, I love his stuff whenever I see it. And this one, it's kind of like the difference between art versus commerce, sort of.
Right.
Because of what makes a good old comic? Well, is it a comic that's like Action Comics #1 that's went for $3.2 million, or is it old Archies and Donald Ducks?
Right, because kind of like Chubbo Wubbo is of the latter, right?
Right, yeah. Chubbo Wubbo, his comics collection is not available online. It's pulpy stuff that he loves, and that to him is the stuff that's really actually worth something. For him, he measures worth very differently than Chad the Lad does.
And another great thing about this one, All New Comics History, is that, I mean, it's not technically a history, but it's a great departure, because most of what Collier seems to do, David Collier seems to do, are the more historical, biographically based comics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that brings me to Hell's Bells, the Railway Pathfinder by, what's the name? Is it Eleni Mai Harris? Somebody who
Larry Mai Harris, yeah.
Yeah, I don't recognize that name at all. But this is a little more of it's a Canadian history sort of comic in 3 pages about kind of the expansion to the west, and it's a pretty dense 3 pages, but it's beautifully drawn, and it's a story that I had not heard before. It's about an intrepid American explorer who's helping them create the railway to link the east to the west coast
of Canada.
Of Canada, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't familiar with this creator before either, but I really like this story.
Yeah, there's nothing in this book that I didn't like. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, now there's some that I scratched my head at first. For instance, Whispered Apologies by Nick Mangdag.
Mm-hmm.
at first I wasn't clear what was going on, but then I went back to reread that first page and a half, and I thought, oh, okay, I see where it's going now. Because that fourth panel, and this is on the first page, and these pages are not numbered, but on the first page of Whispered Apologies, that third panel, the protagonist, we see him earlier sitting at his desk, and then he gets up, and it was this panel that caught me off guard. It looks like he is standing on top of a file cabinet, that he's smaller than the other people in his office. And I'm wondering, okay, what's going on here? Then in that fourth panel, he is walking by a coworker, and he says, oops, sorry. And the coworker says, excuse me. And then that becomes the gist of this comic, that in the workspace, when they meet, with coworkers meet or walk by one another, they kind of abbreviate their language to the point that it almost makes no sense anymore. But that third panel caught me off guard. I mean, does it look like to you that he's standing on top of a file cabinet, smaller?
No. To me, it just looks like he's in an office with cubicles, and we're just seeing him over the top of a cubicle. It's kind of a downward angle, so we don't see his feet. His feet are cut off, but it's not that he's on top of.
Oh, I see. Okay,
he's just walking past. There's a cubicle in the foreground, and he's more in the background.
I see what you're saying now. See, now that you've described that, for some reason, when I first saw him, I thought that he was elevated, not that he was in the background, and so that's what had me confused. But it's a matter of perspective. It's is it the duck bill, or the rabbit ears?
Yeah, maybe you just haven't worked in enough cubicle hellholes like I have.
Yeah, okay, maybe that's it. You got more cubicle perspective.
Unfortunately, yes.
Gene's cubicle perspective.
Yeah, that's a comic nobody wants to read.
Or maybe you can make that one of your strips for next year.
Possibly.
Okay, you heard it here first, folks. But yeah, that's a pretty funny short comic.
Yeah, again, it's all good. The hat, we've got a one-page pantomime comic, which looks like it's from the 1950s, actually.
By Philip Street.
By Philip Street, yeah. It's kind of a magician pulling a rabbit out of his hat, sort of, theoretically. And don't want to give much of it away, but it does a little flip on the rabbit out of the hat magician trope, which we've seen a million times before. But I love it. It's kind of like this kind of two-color strip, and it looks like something that could be like an animated, like a Gene Deitch cartoon or something like that.
Yeah.
But very kind of 50s cool and wacky at the same time.
Cool but wacky. Now, okay, I'm going to say that to me, one of the weirdest comics in this collection is David Lapp's Missing. And I say that almost hesitantly because we have a contribution from Michael DeForge, and that would kind of clinch it right there. The weirdest would have to go to Michael DeForge.
Yeah, that was pretty weird.
But I've gotten used to Michael DeForge, so I kind of know what to expect. But not really knowing what to expect from Missing, this is a weird one-page comic. I mean, I like it. It's just strange the way that it ends.
Yeah, and it's really hard to describe this one. You've got talking dogs, you've got a tree spirit, you've got an older couple who's not quite sure what to do. And I don't want to say too much more, but it's very, very, very odd.
Yes, and
it's if you just look at it, it doesn't look that strange, but it's really when you read it, when you try to figure out how the words and the pictures are going together. It's not structurally strange, it's just thematically. It's like, wow, this is going in odd places.
Yeah, this strikes me as dream material.
Yeah.
And to me, one of the weirdest things is, and again, without giving anything away, what happens here, in this very last panel, the older woman, you mentioned that elderly couple, the old woman has a shovel.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can guess what she's about to do with it, but it still strikes me as really wacky.
Yeah, it's odd. We haven't mentioned Gary Barwin's text feature. There's one text feature called Western.
That's right.
Which to me feels a lot like kind of word. It feels almost kind of word jazzy. I kind of want to hear somebody read this one out loud to me.
Yeah, I feel the same way because I started to read this and I had to keep going back over the first part like 2 or 3 times because I thought, okay, I'm not concentrating well enough. I really don't understand what's going on here. But then it dawned on me, well, there's a reason for that.
Yeah, these are words that just kind of want you to follow along the ride, it felt like.
Yeah. So, if you're looking for straight linear narrative, you're not going to get it there.
No, this is not your place for that.
Yeah. But that's the one piece of fiction in this issue of Taddle Creek. Everything else is comics.
Right, yeah. And again, Michael DeForge is Michael DeForge. It's very kind of a loopy, designy. Feels a little Ron Rigi in places. Mm-hmm. And it's not exactly a punchline, but it's a very weird joke at the end, sort of. Whoever this, basically, if you find a little kid, somebody who looks like a little kid with a very, very wide head in the forest, don't trust him. He's just going to mess you up.
But this is typical Michael DeForge, though.
Yeah, you want to talk enigmatic.
Yeah. Yeah, I like him. And in fact, he has to be one of the most productive guys in comics today. I think this year alone, he has had at least 2 books, or maybe a book and an issue of Loose come out.
Yeah, well, Noah Van Sciver would be pretty close behind him.
Oh, that's a good point.
Noah's done a ton this year.
Yeah, and on top of that, both Van Sciver and DeForge are in Taddle Creek number 36.
Yeah, and for $5.95 Canadian, this is well worth the money. This is a great book that you can spend a lot of time with.
You're right. And one of the reasons why I wanted us to talk about this on the Comics Alternative is not only because this is a great collection of comics, but it's something that our listeners probably would have, or most of them would probably have an extremely difficult time finding. I would say that there may be some bookstores or comic shops, and maybe Quimby's up near where you are, may have this. I don't know of any other, not only comic shop, but even a big bookstore in the States that would carry Taddle Creek.
Probably not. Yeah, I don't think I've seen it in Quimby's before. But yeah, if anybody in Chicago is going to have it, it's probably going to be Quimby's, and I haven't seen it there yet. Again, if they don't normally carry comics, there's kind of no reason. There would be less reason for other places to have it. Like Quimby's carries things besides comics.
Right, yeah. But see, this could also be in a big bookstore or a magazine specialty shop, because this is normally, I guess, kind of a literary magazine. It has poems, it has fiction, but it also has profiles and comics. But this just happens to be an all-comic issue. So if you go into your bookstore, comic shop, magazine outlet, and you cannot find Taddle Creek, then definitely go to TaddleCreekMag.com, and you'll see what we're talking about, and you can order your copy of Taddle Creek number 36.
It also says that there's a you can read the Taddle Creek on your iPad or iPhone. So they've got an app. So apparently you can. If you can't find the printed one, which again, it's on pulpy paper, so find the printed one. But if you can't, it looks like you can get it digitally as well. So that would be a good option if you can't find it locally.
Yeah, but definitely seek this out and go to the Taddle Creek Mag website. And after you do see what we're talking about, send Conan Tobias an email and tell him, hey, the 2 guys with PhDs sent me.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the third title we're going to be discussing today, and this is kind of a big deal. This is Brian K. Vaughan and Marcos Martin's next digital comic. The first one being The Private Eye. This is Barrier, issue number 1 of, I think this is going to be a 5-issue series. And you can find this just as you could The Private Eye, and still can find Private Eye, on Panel Syndicate, panelsyndicate.com. And for those who are unaware, Panel Syndicate is a place that both Vaughan and Martin have developed as kind of an alternative publisher, if you will, of digital comics. And their business model is pay what you want. Okay. Now, Barrier is only the third title to be published on Panel Syndicate. The first was The Private Eye, and then last year they began the first issue of Universe, and I think the second issue of Universe came out earlier this year. And then just this past week, or maybe a week and a half, we get the first issue of Barrier. And this is a very different, in many ways, story from The Private Eye. Now, Gene, when you and I were deciding on what to discuss on this week's episode, I had asked you if you were familiar with Vaughan and Martine's The Private Eye, and you said you hadn't read it yet.
Nope, I hadn't even heard of it.
Wow. Had you heard of Panel Syndicate at all?
I believe I've seen reference to it in places, but I never knew much what it was.
Oh, The Private Eye was one of my favorite comics over the past couple of years. And just this month, Image Comics is putting out this nice hardbound edition of The Private Eye. And I've ordered a copy through Discount Comic Book Service. I just haven't gotten it yet. And I probably won't until the tail end of December, early January, but I'm looking forward to that. But if you're not familiar with Vaughan and Martine's The Private Eye, definitely go to Panel Syndicate and check it out. And like I said, the business model is pay what you want. So you can get an issue of The Private Eye or Universe or Barrier, as we're discussing on this episode. You can pay $1. You can pay 50 cents, you can pay $10, $20 for this first issue, or you can pay nothing. Literally, I mean, when you go in to check out, if you put 0 in, you can still get the comic, and you can get it in CDR or CBR, CBZ, and PDF formats. Now, what you don't get when you pay nothing to download an image of a Panel Syndicate comic is you don't get on a mailing list. But I believe if you do pay for an issue, like a few bucks for an issue of one of these digital comics, then I think you're put on a mailing list where they will let you know when the next issue of that comic comes out. So with Barrier, how would you describe this title?
It's very much it's a very timely title, I suppose, because it's dealing with illegal immigrants coming from the South, crossing over into Texas. I believe it is Texas. Yeah. Into far Texas.
Yep.
Until you get to the end, where it's starting to become something very different, and I actually pretty much guessed where it was going really early on. I guess just because I was expecting it. I'm not sure why I was, but I was able to guess the big reveal pretty early on. But it didn't really spoil the story itself.
Yeah. Now, I don't want us to give away what happens at the end, but I think I know where you're going. What might have given you that sense of where this first issue would end up? Because early on, and I can't remember exactly where, but early on, the illegal aliens are actually referred to as aliens. And in fact, I think this is right after they discover this skinned, severed horse head. And the rancher, Liddy, a young woman named Liddy, corrects someone who's working for her, who, he's actually Hispanic himself, and I think he uses the word aliens. Oh, yes, okay, I'm looking at it now. This is page 5. He says, I know how it sounds. He's talking on the phone to, I guess, Liddy. He says, I know how this sounds, but what if we're dealing with aliens? And Liddy says, she's actually behind him, don't think you're allowed to call them that anymore. And so when I saw that, I got a sense of where this might be going, and I'll just leave it at that. Now, you pointed out a second ago that this is rather timely, given that we're dealing with issues of immigration, the crossing of the border, the porousness of the border. I'm wondering, and I just assumed that Vaughan and Martine had been cooking this up prior to June. Except it's become quite timely since then.
Right.
But, in the wake of the Trumpification of American politics, I guess we could say, this does take on a whole different kind of resonance.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff we've seen before, but the specifics are different. We've got a large focus on the immigrants themselves, and there's a whole lot of Spanish in this book, which is not translated for us.
It's not, and at first, I don't want to say that ticked me, because if I wanted to find out what the Spanish characters are saying, then I could try to, if nothing else, go to Google Translate, right?
Which is what Vaughan actually tells us to do in the afterword at the end of the book.
Yes, there's a one-page afterword that apparently he finished writing the day that this went up at the 1st of January, and he says that you may feel like you need to run out to look up Google Translate if you can't speak Spanish, but he assures readers that it's not absolutely necessary in order to appreciate where this is going. So for those who are going to be reading Barrier issue number 1, and you start seeing a lot of Spanish that is not translated, which is unusual in comics. Usually there's an indication that another language is being spoken, even if it's in English. He says, you don't need to go out to Google Translate. If you can translate it yourself, fine. If not, you can still understand where it's going. So I think that that's an interesting choice to make.
Yeah, and I understand the fact that it's pretty clear just kind of in general what's happening, but I hate the fact that I know there's nuances going on in the text that unfortunately, I'm a stupid American who knows no Spanish.
Exactly, and the anal part of me wants to go and translate that.
Right. I was hoping that there would be some kind of interactive thing in the PDF that would allow us that option. Mm-hmm. So just click on a panel and then the translation pops up. But unfortunately, we don't have that.
No. Now, see, that's the kind of digital comic format that you would see something like, I guess, in a Mark Waid digital comic. This is...
Yeah, or like Ulysses scene that Robert Barry does, where he's adapting James Joyce's Ulysses. When somebody speaks a different language, you click on the panel, the translation pops up.
What I mean by that, it's a dynamic digital comic.
Right.
And, we've talked about this on the show a few times. I mean, I have no problem with that form of digital comic creation. It's just not my favorite. Maybe I'm a little more old-fashioned and like the static digital, where you have, where basically the digital page is the page and there's really nothing much at all interactive about it. And that's what you'll find with Panel Syndicate comics.
Yeah, well, for me, that's not really. It's a smart use of digital to be able to say if you've got this way, you can look at the page with just the Spanish on it. But if you want to, if you could just click on it to get a translation, that to me that just added value. That's not like when they'll throw an animation in ways that slows down the reading or something like that.
Right, or just makes the file that you're downloading that much bigger.
That much bigger, right? Yeah.
Now, one of the ways I love what this comic does, this first issue, is how Martin and Vaughan bring together the two stories, because we have the story of the aforementioned Liddy, but there's also the Mexican or the Spanish story of Oscar, and Oscar is part of a group of people who are crossing the border. Now, I believe they begin in Honduras, correct?
Right.
Yes. And so we have Oscar's story and then we have Liddy's story. And the way that they bring these two stories together, and this begins on page 36 of the digital comic that I'm looking at. And I think this is great because what we see for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 panels is basically a page. And just as with the Private Eye, the page is long horizontal. Okay. So we have basically a breakdown of what you could say are 3 panels. Okay. On the left is a panel that we see Liddy, and on the right is a panel where we see Oscar. But then in the middle is kind of a shared image of what both of these characters among these 7 pages are each experiencing. So on page 37, it takes place during night, and we see both Oscar and Liddy outside in different places, okay? But the big consuming middle panel, and it takes up most of the page, is a night sky.
Right, yeah, and those middle panels are basically sky all the way through.
Right, and so that next page is taking place during the day, and so it's a daytime cloudy sky with both Liddy and Oscar outside. But that middle panel is a little smaller. And then page 39, it's a red sky, really hot. It's a little smaller than the previous two. Page 40, I guess birds or vultures flying, a little smaller. And then page 41, a little smaller, until you get to the last time this is done, where you have just a strip of black on page 43 that separates Liddy from Oscar. And we see that for all practical purposes, they're now in about the same place. And it's at this point that we have the big, as you were saying now, expected for both of us, turn, and their stories come together. And I think that's a great way in a unique way of handling panel layout among those several pages.
Yeah, and it's I like that a lot. And I was wondering because my first thought when I was starting to read this was that, well, okay, when this goes to print, because probably it will go to print with these two creators behind it, and I guess the last one did as well. What format is it going to take? Are they going to like stack two pages together? Or is it going to be kind of a landscape version? Because a lot of webcomics that are kind of formatted landscape, you'll throw two panels together to make kind of a more traditional shaped comics page.
Right.
For this one, I'm guessing they're probably going to keep it landscape. And the thing is, that transition that we're talking about there, the slowly bringing together of those two stories, it works so well digitally, because as you flip from one page to another, you can really see that the change in the size of that middle panel happening. Once you print this, even if you don't stack the pages, they're going to be a page. You're going to have recto and verso. You're going to have right and left next to each other. You're going to lose that kind of sense of the stories coming together visually. You'll still see it on the page, but it works so much better, I think, digitally, where the page just replaces itself rather than seeing the two pages next to each other.
Right.
It just works really well. It's a really smart, good use of digital delivery. That again, it will still work print wise, but it works so much better in the digital native file like this.
Okay, I would bet you money that this will see print for no other reason that we're going to see The Private Eye very soon in print. And
right.
In fact, Vaughan references this in his afterword. He says, I know, aren't we filthy liars? Didn't we say we'd never do a print version of that story, meaning The Private Eye? And in fact, Gene, when we had Brian K. Vaughan on the show back in January, we even asked him about putting The Private Eye out in print, and he said, we have no plans of doing that.
But that's not a no.
Yeah, it's not. And I remember at the time thinking that his answer to us on the show was not unequivocal no. And I think he had said a more unequivocal no in previous comments that he made when The Private Eye first came out. It's like, this is digital only. We will never put this out in print. But then when we asked him back in January about that, he said, no, we have no plans for that. So yeah, he had no plans, but it's not unambiguously no.
Right.
And I'm wondering about the conditions under which he and Martine decided to put The Private Eye out in print, because he mentioned something about Kirkman and The Walking Dead. Apparently, The Walking Dead, there's going to be an installment of The Walking Dead on Panel Syndicate.
Right, that's what I got from that afterward as well.
Right, but I don't know if Vaughan and Martine are going to be writing that Walking Dead installment, or if this is still going to be, a Kirkman piece and Adlard. I don't know.
Well, he does say that it is very it says telling the very canonical story that Marcos and I came up with.
Right. So is it their story, and are they going to do it, or is it their story and Kirkman and Adlard are going to do it?
I guess we'll find out, but I guess it could very well be Martine and Vaughan.
Mm. So did this first issue of Barrier hook you enough to where you're going to come back to Panel Syndicate for the next 4 issues?
Yeah, I believe so. I'm curious to see how it goes. I love Martine's art a lot. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons I think that Mark Waid's Daredevil works so well is a large part of that was Martine's art as well, and I loved him on She-Hulk as well. He's done a lot of stuff that I like, and this is it's really accomplished. It's a little more. It almost seems a little more detailed than I've seen in the past.
Mm. Well, you definitely
at a larger size.
You definitely have to check out The Private Eye.
Yeah.
Okay, Gene, you want to get to the final title, or actually titles that we're discussing. This has to be one of the weirdest comics we've ever discussed on the Comics Alternative.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. This is the Unabridged Graphic Adaptation, iTunes Terms and Conditions, Parts A and B and Parts C and D, by R. Sikoryak, or Bob Sikoryak. If you haven't heard about this, I'm kind of surprised because lately it's been in a lot of like at least the higher geek news, but I think it was even in the Washington Post, New York Times had articles about it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I've seen it in a lot of. There's been a lot of ink spilled on it, especially digital ink, but in a lot of different places. Basically, what Sikoryak has done is he's taken, everybody clicks through licensing agreements. Nobody takes the time to read all those things, right? When's the last time you ever read a licensing agreement when you're installing software? Nobody reads it. You click I agree. You click no, really, really I agree, and then it installs.
Right.
What Bob's done, he downloaded that damn thing, he took all that text, and he's adapted it in comics form, which is insane. What's even more insane is Bob does what Bob does so well, is adapt it using different styles of comics. Because if you know Bob's work, primarily, probably most people might know it from Masterpiece Comics that Jordan Quarterly put out a while back, where he would adapt classic literature in terms of classic comics. So like the very first thing that I ever saw from him, I'm pretty positive, was his adaptation of Dante's Inferno done on Bazooka Joe comics in Raw Volume 2.
Yeah, Raw.
Yeah, that was probably the first thing. The second thing I probably saw was good old Gregor Brown, where he adapted Kafka's Metamorphosis as a series of Peanuts comic strips, which blew my mind at how freaking brilliant it was.
Right.
Masterpiece Comics collects those things, plus a bunch of other things. Little Nemo, kind of a Little Nemo version of the picture of Dorian Gray. What is it?
Little Lulu with the Scarlet Letter.
Little Lulu with the Scarlet Letter, Batman and Crime and Punishment. Mm-hmm. Even going down to Beavis and Butthead doing Waiting for Godot. Just absolutely brilliant stuff. And what Sikoryak really excels at, he not only can draw like other cartoonists, he thinks how they think, and he tells stories the way cartoonists do. So they're not just simple adaptations. He's not just taking a classic comic and putting it in comics form. He's doing it in the style of someone else, but it doesn't just look like that of the cartoonist. The layouts, the storytelling rhythms always feel like the original comics as well as the original stories.
Right, exactly. Now, you mentioned a strip that was collected in Masterpiece Comics, and that is a picture of Dorian Gray in the style of Little Nemo and Slumberland. It's funny that you mentioned that, because last week we did a publisher spotlight on Locust Moon Press, and last year Locust Moon did this. I've never held it in my hands, but I've heard about it. This incredibly large, Little Nemo Dream Another Dream collection where people pay. Oh, you've got it? Oh, I'm envious. Okay, so are you getting? They have a sale. Are you going to get me a Christmas present?
We'll see.
Okay, because last week we didn't talk about that comic. Unfortunately, we didn't get a review copy of it. But Toon Graphics, Francoise Moulet's Toon Graphics, they did kind of an abbreviated version and more contained version for, I guess, all age readers, younger readers especially, and that is Little Nemo's Big New Dreams. And they selected about 30-some from that larger collection, and one that they did include was Bob Sikoryak's Little Nemo, but this time around it wasn't Oscar Wilde, it was Freud's interpretation of dreams.
Yep.
Which is great. And I think I like the interpretation of dreams better than I do the Oscar Wilde.
Yeah, well, it's thematically, it's note perfect.
Right. But I found out about the unabridged graphic adaptation of iTunes Terms and Conditions back in the late summer, and I can't remember the context. I know that for the past year or two, I've been I guess about 3 years now, I've been corresponding with Bob. I was doing an article that came out a couple of years ago on comic adaptations of Nathaniel Hawthorne stuff, and it was going to be in a special issue of the Hawthorne Review. And they were also going to reprint his the Scarlet Letter adaptation, Little Lulu, in that same issue. And so I was contacting him about this, and that's how I got to start corresponding with him. And I even did an interview with him for the blog a couple of years ago. But at some point earlier this year, he and I were going back and forth, and he mentioned something about iTunes terms and conditions. And I said, oh, I hadn't heard about that. He said, oh, in fact, I'm working on parts C and D right now. And this was before SPX. And so he and I planned on hooking up at SPX, and that's when he, gave me or pointed me to the copies of the iTunes Terms and Conditions adaptations. And I think the Part C and D book had just come out.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember how I first heard about it. I mean, I follow him on Facebook and Tumblr and Twitter and all those places like that. And I'm an unabashed Sikoryak fanboy, so I try to gather everything of his that he puts out. So I was able to get parts A and B. I think I got it from from either Inkbrick or Birdcage Bottom Books. Again, it's been published in 2 parts, and they're both available usually when they're not when they're not back ordered through either Inkbrick or Birdcage Bottom Books online. That's a good place to get them. Although luckily, since I'm blessed to live in Chicago, I can actually pick these things up at either Chicago Comics or Quimby's or places like that. Some of your bigger stores that was going to carry interesting mini comics may have them in stock as well.
Right. And you can find out more about this at his website, and that's Sikoryak. That's RSIKORYAK.com. And this first one that came out, now the first volume has both parts A and B of the iTunes Terms and Conditions, and the second one has parts C and D. And parts A and B, it says, was drawn in 4, and he even talked about that. I talked to him, I don't know if you remember or not, or if you've listened to that episode, but when I was at SPX, I sat down to talk with him probably about 15 or 20 minutes. It was a great interview. And he said this at the time, that these were the result of several 24-hour sessions. What Scott McCloud had, advocated in the past. These 24-hour comic productions that he then went back to retouch, and so we have. Again, a strange setup. So the text itself is the word-for-word, unabridged, latest as of June version of iTunes Terms and Conditions, but we have a variety of different styles. Yeah. And you and I were talking right before we started to record. If you read the actual terms and conditions and you're looking for a link to the particular comics or the action that's going on, and even better, the style of whatever comic or artist that he is drawing under the influence of, then you're not going to find much connection, but that's okay. It's not as if you're at a particular point in the terms and conditions and that you would say, okay, this is a perfect Ditko section. And so, of course, it makes sense that he's giving us the old Amazing Spider-Man. It doesn't work that way at all. There are times where you wonder if maybe there is some kind of connection going on between the actual text of iTunes Terms and Conditions and the art that he's produced on the page to encase that text. I think that's more of a matter of chance than otherwise, though.
Well, sometimes it's chance. I think sometimes there's I think he just going through pages, because, again, he's drawing pages from almost every kind of comic imaginable, from comic strips to American superhero comic books to humor books to bande dessinée to manga. Every page, basically every page in the entire adaptation taken all together is 94 pages long over the course of these 2 books. And so every page comes from a completely different title or cartoonist or artist as you go all the way through. So you can jump back and forth. I mean, the very first page comes from Rex Morgan, MD, and then you go from Rex Morgan to Little Lulu to Astro Boy to Dark Knight Returns to X-Men.
And you get actual issue numbers where he's pulling that influence. And so it's not just Little Lulu in general. It's 1956 Little Lulu number 92.
Right, yeah, and so basically he's not just drawing in the style of someone else, which is what he normally does. Basically, he's redrawn whatever page he's done. He's redrawn it top to bottom, and the main character is always Steve Jobs.
Yes, exactly.
So you got somebody with the black turtleneck, the glasses, and the scruffy beard.
Right.
Like you go from Rex Morgan as Steve Jobs to Tubby, to Astro Boy himself, to Batman, to on page 5 of Part A is actually from John Byrne and Chris Claremont's X-Men. And so what we have on that page is Steve Jobs as Cyclops talking to Marvel Girl, who's drawn as Marvel Girl.
Right.
And then the last panel of that one, every once in a while you'll get like a little kind of a thematic echo, because again, pretty much all the words are either third person narration, or it's the Steve Jobs character either thinking or saying the words. And the very last panel of page 5, Scott and Jean are kissing, and Scott is saying, gift recipients must have compatible hardware and parental control settings to utilize some gifts. And that was kind of an interesting thematic thing, because we need to have compatible hardware, and we've got a big kissing romance scene happening there. You get little things like that happen in a bunch of different places. There's a page in Part C and D that's taken from Persepolis, where the Steve Jobs character is the professor who's kind of almost like lecturing the people sitting around the table, but the lecture is part of the terms and conditions.
Right.
And the funniest part of these is whenever there's a link, a hyperlink in the text. So somebody will like say http:// blah blah blah, and it looks ridiculous in print, which is just part of the fun.
Right. And you're right. There is a wide array of different kinds, different styles, and different periods within comics history, and not just North American comics history.
Right.
Because, as you pointed out, there's quite a bit of manga in here as well. One of the things that I found interesting was the choice of very contemporary comics that he would pull from. So, for instance, in this first volume, which includes parts A and B of the Terms and Conditions, I think the most recent comic that he pulls from Regatelemeyer's Sisters from 2014, and then Ali Brosh's Hyperbole and a Half from 2013. And then in the volume that has parts C and D, we do have Kate Beaton's reference to Kate Beaton's Hark a Vagrant, and even more recent, the Tamaki cousins, This One Summer. And, I'm wondering, now, some of these that are very contemporary, kind of like the Tamaki's This One Summer and the Telgemeier, I'm sure that was just forefront in his head at the time. Because, at the time that he was doing this, these are some of the creators who were getting a lot of press. So, on the one hand, it makes sense to me that they do get a tip of the pen in these 2 volumes of the Term and Conditions. On the other hand, there are some creators here who are conspicuously absent. And so I'm wondering, why include a reference to This One Summer and not, let's say, Gilbert Hernandez? Now, we get Jaime, but we don't get Gilbert. But you can say, well, at least we do have a coverage of Love and Rockets.
Yeah, well,
you can't include everyone.
Yeah, even with 93 pages, there's only so much as you can do.
Exactly. But okay, if I had a choice between, let's say, Raina Telgemeier and Gilbert Hernandez, you better believe who I would fall down on is the more important of the two. But that's me. Maybe it's a stylistic choice.
It's a strange, yeah, and I'm not sure that important is really the criteria here. I think part of the fun of this project is the sheer variety of pages. Like in part 2, you can go from pages 84 and 85. We go from Julie Doucet to Otto Binder and C.C. Beck.
Right.
Those are amazing jumps there.
Oh, I agree. I mean, you have no argument for me that the fun of this is the variation of style from one installment to the next. I mean, I see that. And, of course, there's no way to include everyone. It's just, where's Seth? he's not here.
You can play that game forever.
Yeah, I know you can play the game forever, but it just seems to me that there are certain creators who have made much more of a mark. But again, that's not where he was going. He wasn't, doing the top 10 in terms of historical significance.
Yeah, and you do get Mobius, so.
Yeah, you do get Mobius. I mean, you do get a lot of the biggies.
But what I like about it is the fact that the taste that the references are so varied. It's not just like he drew from the top 100 of like the Comic Journal's top 100 comics of the 20th century, whatever like that. You got a little bit of everything in there.
Yeah,
you get one page that's 4 different Dennis the Menace comic strips. Right next to a Gene Colan Doctor Strange.
Right.
It's just amazing. And the Ali Brosh thing, the hyperbole and a half page is just so hilarious because her style, I mean, she draws in Microsoft Paint. It's so minimalistic. And that's juxtaposed with a page of Gil Kane from the Ring of the Nibelung. It's just like, wow.
Right, you get whiplash going from one to the other.
I was just going to say that's one of the biggest whiplash stylistic shifts. I was going to use that word actually.
Yeah.
In the book itself.
Come back to something that I was saying earlier. I don't want you to think that I was belly aching about the fact, where's Seth or where's Gilbert Hernandez? I mean, they're some of my favorites. But the flip side of that is that he also pays attention to people who are very timely right now, who, maybe years from now will not be. So, for instance, over the past year, we've got, the Tamaki cousins have gotten a lot of press with this one Summer. But then again, several years ago, someone like an Alex Robinson got a lot of press with Box Office Poison. But we don't hear as much from him. And by the way, his new book, Our Expanding Universe, just came out, which is fantastic. Okay, that's an aside there. But again, I mean, so he also is paying attention here to names and creators who are kind of at the forefront of reviews and critics' references right now, but who may not be in another 2 or 3 years. And so, I mean, that does add a variety in a way itself. Right,
yeah. And like we even got Alex Bloom, who is not a cartoonist name that generally trips off the tongue, but that's the cartoonist behind the Hamlet Classics Illustrated from 1952.
Right.
So, I mean, I recognize that panel right away because that's a very weird scene. You get the whole Hamlet soliloquy in one page, in one panel, the gigantic text balloons in the original panel, in the original version of that. So, when Steve Jobs is giving us a big, gigantic chunks of text there, it kind of makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
It's hilarious.
To me, the most fun that I had with these 2 issues of the Terms and Conditions is going through them and trying to figure out, sometimes easily, sometimes not so easily, who he was referencing, style-wise, artist-wise, comic-wise, on whatever page he's on. And if you're unsure, like for instance, if you look in the second volume on page 86, and by the way, the page numbers kind of the second volume, its pagination picks up from when the first one leaves off.
Right.
So it's not just the page number in the second volume; it's the page 86. I mean, you can look at that and you see Linda Berry, unambiguously Linda Berry.
Right.
But then you get to 87 and you go, oh, I thought, like, what is this? And I had to look at the back. And one of the great things that Bob does is in both of these issues, he includes a reference and inspiration list. So on page 87, that this is a tip of the pen to Picture Stories from the Bible, issue number 3 from 1943, created by Montgomery Milford and Donald Cameron. I would not have known that.
No, that's one that I did not guess that one off the top of my head.
Yeah, and some of these you can guess easily, some kind of well and easily, some they're very difficult, so thank God for that reference list in the back.
Right, and just since we looked at those 2 pages, the very next page there, page 88, which is actually a reference to Simpsons Comics 74 from 2001, Ian Boothby and John Costanza. That actually is the page of the day because, like I think I said earlier that this book lately has been getting a lot of press. It didn't get press because of these printed comics, though. It got press because after Bob was done with it, he decided, let's serialize it on Tumblr. So one way to read this is to go to iTunes T&C, iTunes letter T ANDC.tumblr.com, and he's been serializing it 1 page a day. And today's page is actually page 88. He's almost done with it. And it's once this became a Tumblr, and people could, and then it goes to Tumblr, goes to Twitter, goes to Facebook. People saw it; they started to reshare this thing. It kind of became a small internet phenomenon, and that's when it got picked up by all these different news sources. Not because of the print books. People didn't see. People like me saw the print books, but it didn't really become into the public consciousness until it actually became virtual. Because then it can become shareable. It becomes more meme-like, and people can point to it easily. Because again, unless you're going to Inkbrick or Birdcage Bottom Books, or you've got a really good comics and zine shop in your town, you're just not going to see these things, unfortunately.
Yeah, and you're right. The Tumblr is probably the better place to go, because if you go to his website that we mentioned earlier, rsikoryak.com, it has a lot of information, but it's not the most up to date.
Right, and again, and the iTunes TNC.com, Tumblr.com. Again, you can go back to the beginning and read every single one of these. I still love the fact that I've got these little books on my shelf as well. Again, the parts A and B has got a great Steranko riff cover. Part B, we've got SpongeBob SquarePants as Steve Jobs. And again, so they're a lot of fun to read, but it really works. Digital makes so much sense for this as well, because again, everybody who's seen the iTunes terms and conditions before, you only see it when you're on a computer in the first place.
Right.
So it really makes sense. The Tumblr was a really smart idea to get it out there in front of a broader audience, and an audience that would really appreciate kind of intuitively the bizarreness of this project, because it is a really, really bizarre project.
Right.
Who devotes time to do this? Thank God Bob Sikoryak does.
Yeah. You know, this is great. This is the first time that we have had a sustained discussion of Bob Sikoryak on the Comics Alternative, and it's a long time in coming. Now, I said that we mentioned him last week, but he was just part of a larger anthology collection, Little Nemo, Big New Dreams. So it's good that we finally turned to an actual comic, or in this case, comics, from Bob Sikoryak. So
yeah, have we done a Rotland Press publisher spotlight yet?
Nope, we have not.
Oh, because he's got one of his more recent things also is Rutland Press has a series called Rotten Dreadfuls, which are kind of like small comics chapbooks, and he did one called Sadistic Comics, which is basically a version of the Marquis de Sade told through Wonder Woman comic book covers. Instead of Sensation Comics, it's Sadistic Comics.
How appropriate!
Oh my God, is it brilliant?
Well, that's something to think of for next year.
Yeah, because Rutland has a ton of great stuff.
For today, we had plenty to talk about. We started off with Adrian Tomine's Killing and Dying. After that, we looked at issue number 36 of Taddle Creek, which is edited by Conan Tobias. After that, we looked at issue number 1 of Barrier, written by Brian K. Vaughan, with art by Marcos Martin. And then we wrapped up with, as I say again, one of the strangest comics that we've ever discussed on the Comics Alternative, R. Sikoryak's The Unabridged graphic adaptation of iTunes Terms and Conditions. So next time you install a piece of Apple software on your computer, just go ahead, click through. Don't read it there as you're installing, but go to either, if you have the hard copy of the iTunes Terms and Conditions, you can read that as you're installing, or as Gene mentioned, you can go to that Tumblr page and read it that way.
Either way is fine.
That's right. And where you can find great comics like this is by going to the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. If you go to dcbservice.com, you're going to find great works such as Killing and Dying and tons of other comics. Or if you're someone who prefers to use Amazon.com, well, fear not, dear listener. You can get your purchases through Amazon and support the Comics Alternative. If you go to comicsalternative.com/Amazon, you'll see that you'll find a banner that you can click through and make your purchases on Amazon that way. As a result, we get a few cents kickback. So take from Jeff Bezos, give to the Comics Alternative. It is the giving season after all.
Exactly.
And after you do get your comics from either Amazon or Discount Comic Book Service, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see that you can leave us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe, or you can call us the old-fashioned way. The phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can email me directly at derek@comicsalternative.com. And Gene, how can they get in touch with you?
Oddly enough, Gene@comicsalternative.com.
Go figure. You can also find us on Twitter. We're at 2guys with PhDs. We're also on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, Google+, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, and you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's a lot of internets.
Right. We like to be all over the place. And in a good way.
Exactly.
So, Gene, this is probably the last episode that you and I will be on together before the new year. So I hope you have a very happy holiday.
Yeah, you too. And I believe I'll be seeing you very soon at the start of the new year as well.
Yeah, we're going to tease that Gene and I are going to be back with an interview, maybe to start off the new year, our very first episode of 2016 with Craig Yo.
Yo-ho.
That's right. Yo-ho-ho. What better way of sending us off into the holidays? So until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Gene.
We'll see you later.
Take care.